All right, everyone, welcome. We're going to give it just another minute, and then we'll get going here. All right, I'm gonna start, and other people can hear the end of our opening as they join. So welcome again, everyone. Thank you for joining us for Farming in the Face of Climate Change, one of the sessions in the Massachusetts Food System Collaborative's 2021 forum. Of course, we had hoped that we would all be able to be together for this, but it's great to see so many of you here, and we're looking forward to a great discussion. I'm Jeff Cole, the Ag Network Coordinator for the Collaborative. My focus this year is on climate and supports around climate change that farmers might need. This year's forum is an opportunity to look broadly at how the various parts of the food system intersect and support each other, how they sometimes put pressure on each other, and how all of your work can help the local food system be more sustainable, equitable, and resilient. We hope that these sessions will add to your thinking about the issues we discuss, their connections to your work, and about how we can all work more collaboratively towards our shared goals. We'd especially like to thank our sponsors listed on the slide here for their support, which has allowed us to keep forum registration free for everyone this year. Some of the usual housekeeping reminders for today's call. Please keep yourself on mute during the presentation. And it's probably a good idea for non-speakers to also not run your video. Introduce yourself in the chat if you'd like, with your name, organization, and preferred pronouns. Please use the chat for questions and comments at any time, although we will have an opportunity for participants to talk for a few minutes on each section. We're going to be recording the session to post online. To start us off, I'm going to make a distinction between weather, that which we experience every day and farmers have dealt with for eons, and climate, the average weather over 30 or more years. At the end of the day, what we will talk about today is both weather and climate and how those may impact farmers. Sorry. These are the topics that we will cover partly. Our panelists today are Caitlin Parsons, Director of Government and Public Affairs at Mass Farm Bureau, Chris Grant, owner of Grant Family Farm and Secretary and Treasurer of New England Vegetable and Berry Growers Association, Tom Akin, Mass Conservation and Planning Policy, USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service, Erin Lane, Climate Science and Outreach Specialist at USDA's Forest Service, Dr. Dave Hollinger, Director of USDA Northeast Climate Hub, and Caro Roszell, Soil Health Specialist of American Farmland Trust. To get right into the topic, we've put a link to their more detailed bios in our chat, and you feel free to access this. Our conversation will be in two parts. Questions each panelist will cover in part one are, what is one climate change in climate conditions that you think will impact Northeast farming most in the short term, and one in the long term, and they can be the same? And what are key current strategies to address these conditions, and what are key future strategies? The second set of questions are there current policies that help or hinder these strategies, and what improvements to existing or new policy would you recommend? We've planned 5 to 10 minutes for audience input after each question, and we'll have about 3 minutes or so if we stay on schedule for a wrap up. All right, we are ready to go. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and we can begin. So Tom and Caro, if you would take it away with the answers to your questions.
Hi, everyone. My name is Tom Akin. I work for the Natural Resources Conservation Service in Amherst. And one of the climate conditions, or actually two of the climate conditions that we see farmers dealing with are extreme precipitation, either the lack of rain or too much rain at one time. And here at NRCS, we, over the last several years, we've been focusing on helping farmers address soil health issues on their farm and trying to educate farmers on the principles of soil health and the four factors that farmers can use to improve the soil health by reducing tillage, keeping the soil covered at all times if possible, planting winter cover crops, and diversifying crop rotations. These practices help build soil organic matter, which in turn helps conserve moisture during times of drought. It acts as like a soil sponge for holding moisture, but it also helps in improving drainage by improving the soil structure. So we get the rain from our big events back into the soil, recharging groundwater more quickly. Overall, it helps reduce disease pressure and reduce runoff events. So we think that cover crops and reduced tillage are a huge part of helping farmers be more resilient and improve their soil health. And Caro, would you like to add anything to that?
Sure, yeah, I guess just as a point of inquiry, are we just talking right now about what topic we want to focus on, or are we getting into strategies already?
No, well, you're going to cover two things. You're going to answer the question, what is one change that you think will impact Northeast farming most in the short and near term, long term, I mean, and at the same time, then follow that up with what are key current strategies.
Awesome, thanks for the
and future strategies.
Perfect, thank you. Yeah, so I'll also talk about the changes to our precipitation patterns, because that's what I hear the most about from farmers. In particular, I think what's challenging about our changing precipitation, which I completely agree with Tom, is not only that we're having more droughts and more intense precipitation, but that our intense precipitation is projected to be concentrated into our winter and spring when our soils are particularly vulnerable, especially for agriculture that uses tillage. So I am seeing increased interest from farmers in all the soil health management practices that NRCS works on, that Tom mentioned, particularly cover crops, tillage reduction, and organic inputs like compost and mulch. And some of the strategies that our team at AFT is really currently pursuing with farmers around cover crops specifically include helping dairy farmers to try out earlier corn varieties to extend their days in cover crops, harvesting certain cover crops for feed, helping farmers move from single species cover crops to mixes, and studying the use of cover crop green chop as a mulch for no-till organic vegetable fields. I think it's important to flag that organic farmers face the challenge of not having herbicides in their toolkit, so helping them develop effective strategies for tillage reduction and weed management and cover crop termination will be an important strategy for organic acres. At the small scale, we see things like tarps being an effective strategy, but at the larger scale, it's a little more challenging. And so one strategy I'm seeing is the use of cover crops being harvested as mulches and then spread on acreage and then planting through it with no-till transplanters. But that's a hard system to dial in. And no-till transplanters are pretty rare at the moment in the farming community. So one strategy that we're working on is increasing the availability of no-till equipment for lending. AFT has purchased a no-till transplanter that will be available for lending in the spring. And I think generally increasing no-till equipment lending is a big part of that strategy as well. MDAR's acre program is a great strategy which provides grants for farmers to purchase no-till equipment. So that's a really effective strategy currently. And another area where I think that there's some great movement is increasing cost shares for compost. So NRCS has implemented the addition of conservation practice 808, which helps pay for compost and biochar application. So that's also helping farmers add more compost and biochar to their fields. And really, in terms of strategies for the future, I think the best strategy for the future is anything that we can do now to accelerate all of these soil health practices. Soil health does change slowly, so supporting improvements in farmland conservation now will help our soils to become more resilient as climate change impacts intensify.
Thank you, Caro. Dave, do you want to take it up next in terms of what are changes that you think are going to be most impactful, short and long term, and the key current strategies and future strategies?
Yeah, Jeff, I'd be glad to. I just wanted to kind of warn people, my internet's been kind of unstable, so I'm speaking through my phone, even though I'm sitting here also on my computer. Can you hear me okay right now?
Yes.
Okay, terrific. So I'm Dave Hollinger. I'm with the Department of Agriculture, and I'm director of what they call the Northeast Climate Hub. The climate hubs are these regional groups that are supposed to be here to talk to folks about climate change and what people are learning and maybe how you can respond. So I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today, and especially with all these other terrific panel members. I think most of us on the panel probably wanted to pick sort of, more and heavier rains and whatnot, but there are some other issues that are important. And since I've always wanted to be a TV weatherman, I put one of them up as my background today. So I'm just going to slide down here for a moment so folks can see it. And what I wanted to talk about are the rising temperatures in Massachusetts, especially the rising winter temperatures. And even within the winter, especially the increasing minimum temperatures. And that's what's kind of shown here in my background. That sort of solid line was the average temperature between 1895 and 1970. And that red line shows a change between about 1970. So over the last 50 years, the kind of average low temperature in Massachusetts has gone up about 1 degree every 10 years. So it's gone up about 5 degrees. And if you sort of compare that to what average temperatures in the winter were, or average minimum temperatures in the winter were in other places, the winter in Massachusetts, the low temperature conditions, if you will, are almost the same as they used to be in New Jersey. So you could think that Massachusetts has kind of slid south. Of course, things have warmed up in New Jersey as well. And that's the biggest increase in temperature, and if you looked at it seasonally, is in the low temperatures in winter. And there are a lot of consequences to that. I think we've all seen what happens to our rain and snowfall in the wintertime. We're getting less snow, we're getting more rain. It's kind of coming and going. There are lots of positive benefits when it's getting warmer. It's, you're spending less money on heating. It's, easier on the animals outside. The ground is thawing earlier, so the season is maybe starting a little bit earlier. One kind of negative aspect is that with the snow disappearing earlier, any moisture that's in the snowpack is disappearing earlier. So runoff is kind of peaking earlier, and the soils are drying out earlier than in the spring than they used to. So that's one kind of sort of, I guess, negative to this. Another sort of negative, which we really saw a couple of years ago, because 2016 and 2012 were particularly warm winters. is a lot of perennial plants are breaking dormancy early. So it's so warm that they're, starting to bud out. But it doesn't seem that the freezes and really cold temperatures are, we're still getting these kinds of outbreaks of really cold temperatures. And so the result is we're getting a lot of, freeze dieback on fruit trees and whatever. So we had, terrible losses on both of those years in the past. Another bad aspect of this rising winter temperatures, this minimum temperatures, is just the fact that low temperatures often limit a lot of weeds and pests. In terms of trees, the woolly adelgid is a real good example of that, where they know that I think it's -20 or whatever, not even that cold, really kills it back. And there are plenty of weeds that are limited to the south by these cold temperatures. And as they rise, I think we can imagine some of these pests sort of marching northward. So more to deal with. So those are kind of the immediate problems. I think the breaking of dormancy and pest problem is only going to increase, and we may potentially run into problems also if temperatures continue to rise of sort of chill units. So a lot of species require a certain number of hours below a certain temperature in order to start the process of fruit set, and it's possible that we'll run into problems there. I don't think there are too many problems in New England yet. I know that it is becoming a problem in places like Pennsylvania and whatnot to the south. Probably all of you are aware of different, I guess, strategies on this. I mean, certainly planting different varieties, whatnot, that are is one aspect. Another aspect, just to deal with the early break of dormancy, is when it's possible, is to set up fruit trees or vulnerable plants on north-facing slopes. So those are a couple of options. I'm sure folks on here have lots of ideas. It'd be real interesting to hear what other experiences people are having. So I think that's it for me right now, Jeff.
Great, thank you, Dave. Erin, would you like to take it off next again? What's the one change that you think are going to impact farming in the short and long term, and what are key current and future strategies?
Okay, thanks, Jeff. I chose sea level rise. I'm also with the USDA Northeast Climate Hub, and we think about how to help adapt to some of these changes. So we know that sea levels rising globally. It's actually increasing even faster in Massachusetts or really the Northeast. And we're looking at about an inch every 8 years at this point. And that's up to, some of the high estimates say 4 feet by the year 2100. Part of the issue, so that sounds long term, but it's already affecting coastal farms in our area. Part of the issue is that with the increase in sea level rise, there's also this increase in flooding during storm surges, which really end up affecting the farm. So you have kind of this additional flooding stress to the extreme events that Tom and Caro talked about. This can make it too wet for planting or for certain crops, or too salty to grow crops at all. It also increases nutrient runoff. Some of the strategies to deal with this, there are wetland conservation easements as a possibility. That's a pretty drastic alternative for some farmers. There's options and research being done at the Cape May Plant Materials Center in New Jersey. They are looking at planting, looking at what crops can be grown. What are the salt tolerant crops? So there could be a switch in the type of crops. One of my favorites is saltwater hay, because I absolutely love it as mulch. I don't live near the coast, but boy, that stuff works well. And that's becoming a high value crop. So that is an option for farmers. Another is planting native vegetation to to prevent or slow the migration of the more saltwater marsh areas. And that seems to be working in some areas, kind of keeping out the undesired species by planting more native vegetation. And again, that could go well with the wetland conservation easements. Some other saltwater tolerant crops that they're looking into at the Cape May Material Center is barley. There's barley and sorghum. There's a salt tolerant soy. Anything that can kind of withstand these salty soils and the periodic flooding. More expensive solutions, there's a possibility to increase irrigation during the times when the salt water is intruding, and that can dilute the salt water. Or some farmers are adding gypsum, which kind of decreases the excess salt in their soil. Paying attention to amendments, maybe even further from the coast, further than had to in the past, to make sure that they're low salt, so they're not adding more salt into the system. And then Tom and Caro's favorite solution is one that works really well in saltwater areas too, which is increasing the use of cover crops, because they really help that salt leach out of the rooting zone. I've got a couple of my favorite resources on this topic that I'm going to put in the chat box. Thanks.
Thank you, Erin. Caitlin, you're up next.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Caitlin Parsons from the Massachusetts Farm Bureau. So we generally work on statewide policy issues, but the issue that I'm going to talk about changes in climate conditions is both the early frost dates and the late frost dates, which essentially are extending some of the growing seasons for our crops, or in some cases making it harder, like maple syrup, where they depend on the frost to start the maple trees going. Basically, when the frost dates change, as Dave was talking about, the breaking of the dormancy can be earlier or later. You know, we've seen with the peaches a few years ago where the frost totally knocked out some of the crop. So there have been some strategies where the USDA has made a disaster declaration and farmers can get microloans and grants like that. But sometimes it's not enough to keep our farmers going, especially if it's year after year after year. So there are a lot of things policy-wise that we're always looking at to try and help these farmers with their crops. One example is working with a research and education mechanism to create crops that are more tolerant with frost and extending their growing seasons. And additionally, one other topic that I've been asked to cover is labor as well. With these growing seasons changing and shifting, our labor supply has to change and shift as well. A lot of our farmers use the H-2A program and have their guys come certain times of the year. However, as these things change and our growing season could be extended, that program might need to be adjusted. I actually grew up in Hadley, Massachusetts. So in my high school, there was a lot of kids who picked sweet corn in the summers. That whole thing where our school summer vacation is set up so that kids used to be able to work on the farm isn't going to be as applicable if we can grow crops longer throughout the year. And things like maple syrup, as the production, they need the frost, it may have to move north as opposed to happening in Massachusetts. Cranberries as well, with frost damage or cranberry scald, depending if it's too hot, they can also end up as an impacted crop. Additionally, livestock also is something to consider, as far as, a lot of our livestock production, people buy animals in the spring, grow them out through the fall. If it's not as cold in the winter, they may also try and raise them longer, and just having that infrastructure there to have animals in the heat or through the winters in the cold. So those are all different policy concerns that we've been examining at Farm Bureau and trying to bring up to the legislators. And those are the strategies, and we need to hear from our members too, what they view as solutions to some of these problems as the climate continues to change, because Farm Bureau really is a grassroots policy development process. So that's just one of those things where we are really looking at how do we work with the state legislature to make this, make these policy changes that would be effective for farmers within the Commonwealth. And I'll let Chris go after that.
Thank you, Caitlin. Chris, you get to play cleanup for us with this.
Yeah, this is by design. I asked to go at the end. So as somebody whose livelihood depends on growing a crop and selling it, I look at everything that everybody had just said, and looking at this past year of a lot of rain followed by a year of very little rain. You can almost see it with the members of our association who grow vegetables and small fruit of after 2019, everybody was running out and buying irrigation equipment, trying to self-insure that the next year, if it was dry, they could put down some water. And after this year, everybody's calling and asking how to put in drainage, how to get tile, what the whole process is for that. And it's really hard when we look at all these programs and we think that they're all such great ideas, but to get the boots on the ground and the money out of your account to afford things like getting a no-till seeder that's in the comments and things like that. These are huge investments, and I know that they're so important. And to make those proactive investments from a very, very small farmer to the the biggest vegetable growers in New England, people are thinking about it constantly because they see it. More people invested in protected culture, not just to extend your growing season, but growing tomatoes this past season outside was impossible. So to invest in something like growing under a greenhouse or a high tunnel is something that people are really paying attention to, no matter what scale you are or what production methods you use. And I always think of it as an insurance policy of we know our farms, we know our fields, what we don't know is the weather. It's always something that we can complain about. Always a good conversation starter. How was your year? It was wet. Everybody's year was wet. So that's really the way that I come after it as somebody who needs to, look at the right tools, getting a grain drill. I'd love to get a grain drill, but to get the right size grain drill that I want isn't in the budget this year. It may not be in the budget next year. So we're doing it, with less than perfect conditions. We're planting cover crop mixes and things like that, to buffer, and to add organic matter. So it's really just something that this isn't something that's new for farmers to think about because we're out in it all the time, even today. Our forsythia is blooming today. So if that says anything about what we're paying attention to.
All right, thank you, Chris. We've got 5 minutes now for any of you in the audience that wants to add a point. Feel free to raise your hand if you want, or unmute yourself, but please don't do it all at once. So maybe raising hands would be better. And again, I want to remind you, anytime you have a thought or question, don't be bashful, put it in the chat, and we've got people monitoring the chat that will we'll pay attention to it. So, Stephen, I see your hand. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention to the panelists that sometimes the strategies that we might be developing or testing can mean actually more labor that makes kind of the gains that we can get from the strategies. We can lose some of those gains, but because we're having to spend more time out in the field or more time doing something different. Any thoughts there around how we can build some safeguards into our strategies so that we're promoting technology or behavior change that takes that into account? Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Anyone want to take a quick shot at answering the question?
Sure. I was had planned to chat about this a little bit in some of my later comments. But yes, I think that one area where it'd be really important to expand support for producers is both in the innovation side of sort of actually developing new strategies for soil health and climate adaptation on the ground, but also for the transition period when farmers implement a new practice, which is considered tried and true in terms of it's working for other farmers, but we don't always account for the amount of, as you mentioned, added time, labor and risk associated with the transition period for implementing a new soil health management practice and other adaptive strategies. So I think that expanding access to existing programs and creating new avenues of support for farmers to cover their increased costs associated with these transition and innovation processes would be really important.
Thank you, Caro. Rob, I saw your hand up a little while ago. Did you? want
Yeah,
something?
thanks. I took it down when you said, "Does anybody wants to respond to Steve?" And I didn't want to do that, so I wanted to get out of the way there. Yeah, thanks. It's Rob Traver from the Harvard Advisory Commission. This is a question I just put to Caro, and she made a nice reply, but I thought maybe some others would think about it. Any thought about some of these warm season native perennials for hayfields and pastures? You guys gave a range of techniques and strategies. I mean, I'm talking about, what are switchgrass and big blue stem and gamma grass, Indian grass, and whether or not anybody in the area is trying these things to the extent that they're feeding them or baling them, because we're thinking of trying some here in Harvard just for fun, and I'm up for anybody who's given a run.
There are a number of farmers that are planting sorghum Sudan grass, which is, a relative of corn, and it produces a huge amount of biomass, and they're mowing it and chopping it and baling it and wrapping it for baleage. And so it's another one of these dual purpose crops that serves as a summer cover crop, but then can also be harvested for animal forage. So it's kind of a win-win, and it grows really well in wet soils. It's much more tolerant to wet soils than corn is. Regarding other warm season grasses, switchgrass, et cetera, the palatability really isn't there yet. I think maybe in some of our droughtier soils, our really sandy, outwash soils that tend to be droughty, those types of crops will work better. But if you're interested in sorghum Sudan grass, please contact our Worcester County office. He's had several farmers have some really good successes with it this past year.
Good. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you, Tom. And I see a question in the chat, and we'll spend another minute or so, and then we'll move on. The question is, there's safe support for perennials such as hazelnuts and chestnuts, and the infrastructure to support the processing. And does anyone have an answer to that question? All right, I guess not. We will leave that as a question that we need to find an answer to at some point. All right, so we're going to move on to part 2 now. And we'll go in the same order. And so essentially panelists theoretically will be talking about their same topic point. And so we're going to start with Tom and Caro, and the topic now is, are there current policies that help or hinder the strategies that you talked about? And then the second point is, what improvements to existing policy or what new policies would you recommend? But let's start with the current policies.
So USDA current policies, I would say the one that is maybe going to affect farmers in the near future is that cover crops are now, we're able to plant cover crops and farmers can take advantage of crop insurance programs through the risk management agency. That is just a recent rule change. So we're hoping that that will help encourage farmers. This is probably more applicable to farmers in the Midwest than it is here in the Northeast, but still it's helping farmers at least learn more about the possibilities of cover crops. And just the other two things that I would add is that USDA incentive programs we're trying to get more and more people to take advantage of these incentive programs that help farmers install cover conservation practices. So EQIP, the Environmental Quality Incentive Program, and in particular, one that might be more attractive for small farmers, the Conservation Stewardship Program, which helps reward farmers for implementing good stewardship. So I would encourage all farmers to please contact your local USDA offices to just see what's available and just try and start the conversation with your local service providers. Caro?
Yes, thank you. I really agree. I think one thing I'd like to add is it's not exactly a policy, but I did want to flag the expanding availability of technical support, financial support, and education around soil health is really promising, especially what's sort of coming out of farmer-led movements and farmer-engaged networks. So organizations like AFT, as well as NOFA Mass, Young Farmers Network, and the conservation districts are really collaborating a lot right now with the NRCS and agencies like MDAR and Farm Bureau as well, to really understand the importance of farmer-to-farmer learning and are beginning to invest in this kind of learning even more. So there are farmers out there who are really innovating in this space and really learning how to dial in soil health management practices to a very quality degree. And so supporting those farmers to become educators by handling things for them like logistics and outreach, and also honoring their time with speaker stipends, we can really help to accelerate that farmer-to-farmer learning. I think that's a really key approach. On the side of a potential hindrance, I think one thing that I'm hearing about is the periodic introduction of a bill to increase the regulation of on-farm composting. And I think that that's really a threat to farmers being able to make their own much needed organic amendments and to address the fact that compost is very expensive. So I think if that were passed, it would certainly be a hindrance.
But Caro, I just want to make sure that I'm clear. The bill you're referring to is a bill that essentially is going to put control of composting at the local Board of Health and or municipal level.
Right.
Thank you. All right, Dave.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Jeff. I guess first of all, I should say that I'm a scientist with the government. I'm a plant physiologist, and you know, as scientists or researchers, we're not supposed to talk about policy, and they don't mess with our science, and we don't mess with the policy. So if whatever I say, it's kind of on my own behalf. I'm not speaking for the agency. They wouldn't like that. And in terms of in terms of the increasing temperatures, I'm not sure what policy can really do to interact with that. Maybe some of you have some better ideas. I'd be really happy to hear that. I guess one aspect that hasn't come up yet, I'll just mention it real briefly since we're talking about policy, is that the current administration, although nothing has sort of happened yet, it's my guess that something's going to happen very much next year, seems really intent on addressing some of the aspects of climate change, and wants to bring the rural community along with it. And by this I'm talking about storing more carbon in soils. It looks like there may be lots of programs. using our friends over in NRCS, we'll see how that works out. And there may be additional programs in other ways to reduce greenhouse gases by better nutrient management or perhaps feed aspects. So all of this is in play now, and really Congress hasn't passed anything, but there's incredible amount of ideas and actually some fairly big dollar amounts circling around out there. So I would just recommend folks keep an ear to the ground on this stuff, because there may be some interesting opportunities where you can improve what you want to do anyway, soil health, for example. And at the same time, you'll be storing, a big aspect of soil health is it just stores more organic matter, more carbon in the soils. It's a real win-win. So that's all I would say. Just pay attention to what may be happening, because I'm pretty sure something will be over the next 12 months.
Thank you, Dave. Erin.
Right, well, for saltwater intrusion and sea level rise, I already mentioned conservation easements. If local and state government recognize the issue and want to address it, this is a possibility for kind of large scale adaptation to the issue. And the idea behind that is that saltwater marshes are actually very valuable to tourist industry, wildlife, and that sort of thing. And so if we can pay the farmer on that, and with that in mind, then they can shift their production. Another method that is being talked about across the country in regards to various stresses is managed retreat. And that the idea behind that is that we no longer hold the line and adapt to try to prevent the issues, but we accept that and move inland to kind of change the coastline. And that both of these strategies really are a larger level than the farmer, right? It's community buy-in, it's a lot of cooperation. Those are the policies that we're currently seeing. And if I remember right, we are going to talk later about possible improvements to policy. Is that right, Jeff? Okay, then I'll save those for you. Thanks.
Thank you. Caitlin.
Okay, so Massachusetts has one of the toughest economic climates for farmers to operate in, with some of the highest cost of production in the world. And our policies need to take that into account when determining a course of action so that we don't hinder our farmers with additional costs or time, as we were just discussing earlier. So it's definitely important to consider incentives when we're making change. Right now, I know Massachusetts Farm Bureau is working very hard on labor policy. There was a decision not too long ago about a farm in Whately, Massachusetts, with overtime that limited it to specific areas of production and planting within our policy. But the legislature is actually looking to change that even further with a piece of legislation to limit overtime during certain times of the year, which of course, as we were just discussing with climate change, those times of the year when people are needed could actually shift and change, which this legislation wouldn't allow. It would actually put us at a huge disadvantage, as 45 other states don't have any sort of overtime protections for farm workers. And we're competing on a global market. So basically, Massachusetts Farm Bureau is working on behalf of farmers to ensure that as this climate change continues to happen, and as our farmers continue to look at how to employ people, that they have a level playing field as much as possible. So that's just been one of the policies that we've really been focusing on right now. I also wanted to mention too that policy needs to be considered about slaughter facilities. Right now we have 2 USDA inspected red meat facilities in the Commonwealth and no USDA inspected poultry facilities. our farmers drive a long ways to get their animals processed, which is unsustainable, and it does hurt the environment. So any positive policy for slaughter facilities could help us, help our farmers, give them back more time, and basically they stop a reliance on fossil fuels as much. I just wanted to remind everyone too, that when you see alerts come out from your different groups that you're involved in on policy fronts, that it is very key to reach out to your legislators. I know Caro mentioned the policy bill, the bill that's on composting. And I think, you know, every time you weigh in with your legislator, they need to hear from you. There's 7,000 farmers in Massachusetts versus 7 million consumers. So sometimes those decisions will get made for you if you don't have a seat at the table, if you don't weigh in when you need to. So we really encourage all of our farmers to be there and have a discussion.
Thank you, Kate. And again, Chris, you get the bat cleanup here.
I think one of the things when I first read this question was when I go and look for resources or anything from either MDAR or USDA, a lot of times small diversified farmers don't fit into big USDA boxes on applications. When I was going for my farm ownership, you know, loans and things like that, it's really hard to squeeze. You know, I grow vegetables, cut flowers and eggs and chicken. It's really difficult to squeeze a very diversified small farm into a very complicated system that is not built for farmers like us. And we had talked about that for, insurance policies over the past 10 years of, there really wasn't anything under the non-insured policies that you could get for an extremely diversified farm. And now that's changed after many years, and they're really starting to push that, which is exciting. But I still don't know if I'm going to be that kind of person who applies for something like that. I'll just jump right to, one of the solutions is that, we do need more and more people to be, technical service providers in these organizations, at USDA who can help with, farmers' questions and boots on the ground, because I know that they're strapped just like everybody else. And I think, having more people who have the ability to get this information out and help people navigate these big programs is something that I really see a downfall in.
Great, thank you, Chris. So again, now this is an opportunity for anyone in the audience to add to a point, current policy that you think is either helpful or unhelpful or whatever. And again, if you raise your hand, that probably is going to be the best way for us to organize that. Yes, Stephen.
Hello again. I just wanted to mention, we've been hearing about this new micro farm insurance policy that is being launched very soon for small farmers. Maybe if any of you have knowledge or experience with that, you'd like to share the opportunity.
Well, I will jump in terms of I also work for the Caro project, and I see Dorothy, who is a co-worker of mine, is already put in the chat mentioning this program. We're exploring it. It's still being developed, right? Theoretically, it's for relative, small farms. I think under $120,000, somewhere in that vicinity of total revenue. It's supposed to ease the paperwork burden significantly, but the full details of the program haven't been announced that I'm aware of. And our opinion is that until the full details are announced, we really only can be hopeful. Right? If all of a sudden there's a lot more paperwork burden, it may not be particularly helpful.
Thank you.
Anyone else want to say anything?
Question in the chat, Jeff, wondering what can be done to increase farmer-to-farmer collaboration. Ed pointing out that this was a role that UMass played in the past as far as pulling farmers together for gatherings. I remember there being twilight conversations and pasture walks and things like that. Where do we see that happening, and what more needs to be done?
Anybody want to?
Yeah, I'll talk. So the UMass vegetable team and the fruit team still do twilight meetings. The past 2 years have been really difficult with all the restrictions, but they've done a lot of online program too. And I know it's hard to get that face-to-face farmer-to-farmer interaction. Even the New England Vegetable and Fruit Conference next week is all virtual because we didn't know what the COVID situation would be. We do have more programming that's going to be in person, and people are just really excited about that. But they do have a whole series, especially in the summertime, which is really hard for farmers to, it looks like a great program, but it's hard to get done with work and on the road to get to a place by a certain time, especially when there's a lot of other things to do. But I do know that they do their twilight meetings still.
All right. Anybody from the audience? Ed.
I brought up that question because in the past, UMass used to do a yearly gathering, usually around the Worcester area, for all farmers, instead of just vegetable or fruit or sort of specific topic areas. And because, especially with soil health now, we're really into integrated agriculture and diversity. So many of our farms are becoming much more diverse: livestock, crops, vegetables, grains, all sort of things. That was the power of when we had a full statewide gathering of all types of farmers, because it really connected us cross crop, cross what we do, and created collaborations that weren't just within your specific area, but often, if like with the solar thing now, people are going to be putting crops on, often pasture or something underneath, and they're looking for a service of somebody maybe bringing sheep in because it doesn't fit into them to necessarily have a sheep flock. So I think as soil health is expanding, these sort of cross collaborations and needing to meet farmers that normally haven't been in our specific network, it's going to be more important. And that's why I think whether we did it by Zoom or whether we did it in the past, we used to meet somewhere around Worcester and have a whole day, no matter what type of farming you did. I think that's going to be needed again in the future. Thank you.
I can respond to that a little bit and just say that, I agree. And I think that there's a lot of segmentation of a lot of the farmer to farmer events. NOFA puts on a lot of great field days where farmers can meet and visit a farm. AFT is going to be organizing some events in the future. And one thing we're also doing is putting together a farmer consultancy program where farmers can talk to other farmers who are really expert in an area of soil health. But these are sort of smaller scale micro gatherings and individual interactions, which I think are really important. But I hear what you're saying about sort of the need for a larger farmer gathering that cuts across enterprises and scales, and the need for more of that. And I think the New England Fruit and Veggie Growers Conference is a great place to do that. But we should be looking for more opportunities to bring together more diverse farmers under the big tent of soil health, since it really does cut across enterprises and scales.
Thank you, Caro. Well, the next section is to talk about future strategies, and we've already slipped into that. But I'll formally continue to see if people have anything more we want to add, in particular to see if it sees any more discussion from our audience. So Tom and Caro, do you have anything more you want to say about future strategies around extreme precipitation?
I would just like to kind of piggyback off of what Dave said about the changes that are coming out of USDA in the near future. There is going to be a huge amount of emphasis and we hope money to support climate smart agriculture. And the details are slowly coming out. So there's going to be, we hope, more people, more technical service providers, and more assistance for farmers. So that, as Dave said, that's just something to keep an eye on. Just pay attention to the news and just get in touch with your local USDA offices and just find out what's new and what's coming down the pike.
Sure. As I mentioned earlier, I think supporting farmers for good stewardship, finding lots of different pathways for doing that is going to be really important, whether it's for innovation or for new to them soil health management practices. Many people have mentioned these various options in the chat, so I just wanted to flag, as Tom said, the Conservation Innovation Grants Program and other programs that they have. Also, SARE grants has come up in the chat. Those are another pathway to receive support for innovation, but not all farmers who have really good ideas have the time or inclination or research skills to craft a competitive program and administer a research project. So all these programs could be expanded and, whenever possible, to Christopher's point, simplified in terms of their application and administrative burdens. And creating more programs would be great. In terms of transition period funding in the private sector, I just wanted to point out that some brands are beginning to pay their suppliers the added costs of implementing new soil health practices. And so this is something that we should be looking at and expand this kind of support to all farmers. Utilizing funding sources that are coming from the state or from DC, such as infrastructure and American Rescue Act plan funding, could be one avenue to provide some of these farmer supports for innovation and adoption of new practices. And as I mentioned earlier, MDAR is providing this very needed support for no-till equipment purchases through their acre program. But one of the biggest obstacles we're finding in our surveys and conversations with farmers is that many farmers aren't quite sure what equipment they actually need. So it's reasonable when making a big investment, I think, to want to try before you buy. But when you don't know any other farmers who have a certain type of equipment, and we don't have lending programs in Massachusetts, it can be really hard to gain that experience. So expanding the availability of equipment for lending or demonstrations, I think, would really accelerate the transition to no-till for both conventional and organic farms. And this is an issue we're studying through the Massachusetts Coordinated Soil Health Program, which is a consortium of AFT, NOFA-MAS, NRCS, MDAR, and UMass as a collaborative project. And finally, I just wanted to say, releasing the Healthy Soils Action Plan to the public would outline further recommendations and ideas about supporting healthy soils across land uses in Massachusetts, as well as funding the Massachusetts Healthy Soils Program, which was established through the Healthy Soils Bill earlier this year, or maybe last year. Sorry. I think that's all I have for now.
So I'm going to follow up, if you don't mind. I heard you talk about farmers wanting to understand equipment and its use and so on. Years ago, my recollection is that Extension used to do that type of research, right? As part of their research work was testing new equipment or developing new equipment. I can remember Ruth Hazard, I think it was, in her Zeolita in terms of BT application for corn, that type of work. So my question is, have we lost that only locally? Are they in regionally, like Cornell Extension? Is that work still going on? Does anyone know? Or is one of the future strategies that we might consider trying to figure out how to revitalize Extension, probably regionally, not just UMass, to get back into this type of work?
New Hampshire has a wonderful equipment lending program run through their conservation districts. And that conservation district program is funded by the state. It is funded primarily through a license tax, a license plate tax on vanity plates. So, if the Commonwealth of Massachusetts could invest a little money in the conservation districts, it would go a long way to helping farmers. And currently, there is literally no assistance from the state of Massachusetts for conservation districts. So likewise, UMass Extension is also really underfunded. So it's really a question of priorities, I think, and farmers really, I think, have an opportunity to, let their legislators know. But just one more thing, if you go to the Cheshire County Conservation District in New Hampshire, it's the Conservation District, and actually also Rockingham in the southeast corner. They have all kinds of wonderful equipment that are made available to farmers for them to try. So that would be a great model, I think, to explore.
I completely agree. And I should have also mentioned that Massachusetts Association of Conservation Districts is part of our collaborative project. And this is something we've been talking with them about actively. So it's just sort of finding the right pathway for implementing it.
All right, anyone from the audience want to add to the conversation about future strategies? Okay, well, then we'll move on. I'm not sure that we'll end up ending that much early, but we might, and I'm sure everyone enjoys getting out of a Zoom sooner rather than later. So the next topic is improved and new policy. Again, I think we've kind of covered some of it, but I want to give everyone here a dedicated chance to expand on those thoughts. So again, we'll start with Tom and Caro in terms of what you might have to say about new or improved policy around extreme precipitation.
Similar to what was said earlier, we really don't have any recommendations for, or I guess I really shouldn't be espousing policy, but the conservation stewardship program is taking a step in the direction of paying farmers for implementing some of these soil health practices. So paying farmers to reduce tillage and plant cover crops and improve their soil health. They're going to be putting more carbon in the soil, removing it from the atmosphere and just building healthier soils. And I believe this is something that you're going to see coming out in these climate smart ag policies from USDA, is that farmers will be rewarded for this good stewardship. Caro?
Yeah, I apologize if I spoke out of turn. I think I already outlined a lot of my thoughts about that, but I would just agree with you about paying, finding pathways to pay farmers directly for implementing these practices. And there was a story in the Guardian recently about how the UK is starting to implement some of those payment plans, and I think that could be an interesting model to look at.
So I'm going to tread lightly but dangerously into shaky ground here in terms of funding sources for eco services payments to farmers. Ed, do you have thoughts? Does anyone have thoughts on that? And specifically, economists always talk about carbon taxes and credits as the potentially most efficient mechanism for those transfers of resources.
I'll bite, Jeff. I'm not exactly sure where it's going to come from, but if you look at just what's in the Build Back Better bill, if it passes, I have no, not making any sort of advice either way, but in that bill, for example, there's $25 or even $30 an acre for planting cover crops, up to 1,000 acres. There are, literally billions of dollars nationwide working through NRCS for carbon storage in soils. And I think basically they mean, it's another incentive for cover crops or other, reduced tillage, other processes that build up healthy soils. Even if that bill doesn't get passed, I know that within the normal budget process, USDA is still looking for these same sorts of tools. And not just, of course, with agriculture too, there's an awful lot relating to forestry, both for, woodlots, for forest owners as well, for either increasing the rotation length or different species, whatnot. So there's an awful lot of tools. I honestly don't know how they plan on paying for it, but it's certainly near term in a lot of these things. And one other thought too, it's we were hearing from Tom and Caro. I mean, Massachusetts has kind of fallen down in terms of extension, but nobody's mentioned it yet. And I know it's a little outside of my area of increasing temperatures, but the whole agrivoltaic side of things, I think Ed mentioned, sheep grazing around solar panels. I mean, Massachusetts is absolutely leading the country in this, and they have some of the most generous rates for on-farm electricity production with all sorts of bonuses. If pollinator habitat is involved or other factors. So, I guess I would say if you hadn't thought about that, that's another opportunity, and and where Massachusetts really does lead the rest of the country in this. So.
Well, thank you, Dave. And you're up next to continue the conversation around your topic.
I think I just did.
All right, okay, fair enough.
But actually agrivoltaics, by shading the soil, they do reduce temperatures a bit. So there's sort of a tie in there with the temperature stuff, but not in the winter, because you're not going to get anything in the winter time anyway. So there you go.
Fair enough. How about you, Erin? Do you want to jump in?
Sure. Like the other federal employees on the call, I got to stay away from policy, but I can say that if a community wants to help their farmers adapt, and if there are a desire to do it at a community level or state level or even federal level, then there are some steps with sea level rise that I see emerging. One is mapping vulnerabilities or areas that are vulnerable, and I'm speaking about sea level rise, but honestly, this could be expanded to other inland issues as well. There is a mapping project that's getting going at Rutgers right now, and once it's developed, this idea of finding the areas that are most susceptible to saltwater intrusion and that have crops that are vulnerable to it, that could be used in other parts of the Northeast. So hopefully that can be helpful. And then it's establishing, just like anything else, establishing adaptation plans, and from the policy side of things, these specific conservation easement or managed retreat plans. But again, that it takes community buy-in and a lot of cooperation for people to really get together and decide that this is a priority and figure out what to do about it. So that's what I see. Maryland actually has some pretty good examples of this. It's a great place to look if Massachusetts is interested in the changes. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Caitlin, I see the online, the conversation about the overtime, so that might be covered. I wondered if there's anything more you want to add to policy, and this is an opportunity to add to the whole policy, I think, conversation at this point,
Yeah.
not just your particular topic line.
Yeah, definitely. And to follow up on what Erin said, I mean, weigh in when asked. That's what I keep telling everyone. You know, you are the best at telling the legislature about what you do. If you get asked to host a tour, do it. Show them what's going on within your farm and the environment, because that's the only way that the legislators are going to know. I know right now our state house is shut down, but still video testimony is an awesome option just to show them what's really going on. So I highly recommend that. I highly recommend weighing in when asked. And you know, if there's an issue that's concerning you, go to your lobbyist, whether it's Farm Bureau or another organization, because it is important that your voice is heard. I guess one of the biggest things I wanted to drive home is just, you know, climate change affects everything. So it's not just a statewide policy that, you know, needs to be examined. It's national policy and even to some extent international policy. You know, there were different talks going on at one point about the Paris climate change agreement and things like that. That, you know, would impact all of this. So it's a really broad issue that all of us need to keep looking at and examining what the options are. I know at least on a state level, there is legislation to create a disaster relief fund for farmers that I do think some of us should be looking at, just because as the climate becomes more volatile, it's important to keep that going. So, you know, weigh in when you see that come through and remind your legislators that this is important for you. And it could help you in a year where it's a make or break year for you. So that's my advice and where I want to end my comments right now.
All right, thank you, Caitlin. Also, I'm going to throw a question out to the audience before we get to you, Chris. And that is, we heard conversation a while back in this about, I think Chris brought it up, the struggles that farmers have to find the capital to make, you know, buy the equipment, make the improvements and so on. And I know there is a bill to create a public bank that has as part of its core service clientele farmers. And I'm wondering if anyone is aware of it and if people have thoughts that a public bank that theoretically could make lower interest loans more easily available to their legislatively mandated clientele, so to speak, would be a potential future strategy / policy that could be helpful in adapting to climate change.
My initial thought to that is that that's why FSA was set up, to service farmers who couldn't get traditional credit at your local bank, and they are lower interest. It is a much longer race to the finish line to close on a loan like that or get, you know, an operating loan or a farm ownership loan. But, you know, in doing so, you're working with the federal government pretending to be a bank already. And that's my thought on that.
So just for clarity, Chris, are you saying that a Massachusetts public bank would not be helpful or beneficial in that we already have a solution with FSA?
I think the more help for everybody, the better.
All right, fair enough. Well, you again, you get the back cleanup, so go ahead, take it away.
So Caitlin kind of talked about what I was going to say. You know, being a good advocate is a big part of being, you know, a business owner and a farmer. Working with your local boards of health and conservation commissions, know who your state reps are and your senators. I mean, if they don't know that you're there, they don't know that you're there. And if you really have something that you believe in, or you can explain something better by bringing them out to your farm. When we first ran into spotted wing Drosophila here in Massachusetts, there was no way that we could tell the state Senate that, you know, UMass needed money for research on spotted winged Drosophila. They couldn't even spell it. I still can't spell it, but you start that conversation and you say, these are things that are, decimating the raspberry crops. Now it's affecting other small fruit, and it's a fruit fly. There's no mechanism other than yourself to get that ball rolling and saying that this is change that needs to happen, or you're not going to have anybody growing raspberries or fall strawberries and things like that in the Commonwealth. And it took a long time, but it worked out, and they got not a big amount of money, but certainly a starter fund for the UMass entomologists to work and really nail down all the scenarios when it came to this very aggressive fruit fly. And it wouldn't have happened if people didn't start that conversation and be a good example of having somebody come out and see just what the issue is. It's easy for farmers to keep their heads down and not say anything and just complain to each other. But I mean, if there is an issue that you feel strongly about, definitely speak up about it and play the game in the right way, and follow the chain of command and make sure that you're doing a good job with what you're doing and things like that.
Great. Thank you, Chris. All right, so we're going to do wrap up now, but as part of that wrap up, I'm going to open it up to the full audience here. Any thoughts, comments, anything, any burning question that you want to try to cover in the next couple of minutes? Ed, I see your comment in the chat about soil health research. Go ahead, Ed.
Yes, I was very involved with the UN Food System Summit and COP26, and the AIM 4C climate smart agriculture project that Vilsack and Kerry introduced into it. Unfortunately, if you look at the partners in the program, it's pretty much agrochemical and biotech representation. I mean, they're very strong globally in the food system and agriculture system. And we're really going to have to, I think, push a bit through maybe our representatives and stuff in Washington to get soil health research at the regenerative ag soil health level, making sure that that research is strongly implemented into that program. Because even at the announcement, Bob Casey from Pennsylvania was awarded a bunch of money for Penn State to do chemical pesticide research. And of course, we know in regenerative agriculture, with a lot of our leading farmers across the country now, Gabe Brown, Understanding Ag, they're not needing any of these pesticides anymore by implementing the right ecosystems on their farm. And I also thought I'd take a moment to announce, I worked with Carrie Chickering-Sears at UMass, and we were fortunate to be able to put together a webinar for 4-Hers and youth in the state in agriculture. And we're going to invite youth from around New England for a webinar on December 27th at 7 o'clock. We got Gabe Brown that probably many of you are aware of, to do a webinar with our youth on the future of agriculture and their role in it. And I think it's going to be a really exciting webinar for the kids because we have some great 4-Hers and FFA and youth they're our future. They're doing some great work. And it's even going to touch on marketing and stuff, which our kids are really getting into, how to supply local food. So thank you for the time. Thanks.
Thank you, Ed. Anyone else want to say anything?
If I could, this is Marty Dagoberto here. Policy Director with NOFA Mass. It's really great to hear such an edifying and robust conversation on this very important topic. Thank you to our presenters and everyone who's made this presentation happen here. I think there's a lot of good stuff to come from this. And I just wanted to put in a plug for somewhat of a continuation of this conversation at the NOFA Mass Winter Conference on Sunday, January 16th. We're collaborating with American Farmland Trust and CISA and the Collaborative and Urban Farming Institute and probably others to be determined on a roundtable discussion really centered on how we can help boost farmers' voices when it comes to climate policy and action to make sure, to make it easier for farmers to be heard, especially when we have things that are happening during the growing season and all the various hurdles to them being heard in the process. How can we get our heads together and provide more of a platform for farmers in the climate conversation? So I'll post the details in the chat there. Feel free to get in touch for more details if you want to collaborate on that or anything in a similar vein. But thank you again to our presenters and everyone working on this intersection here.
Right, thank you, Marty. One last call for 1 minute. Anyone else want to add to the conversation? All right, then I will share my screen and we will finish up. So again, thank you everyone for joining us today. We hope you'll join us for some of the other forum sessions this week. Winton will post a link to the sign up. And coming up later today at 1 o'clock, we have the Strengthening Community-Led Food System work, and you can see the other days of this week that we're running our forum. So thank you very much again, and have a good rest of your day.